Hello again, everyone. For those who arrived later, we just heard a great testimony from Mayra Gutierrez about her journey with Chagas here in the States. Uh, my role here now is to build a bridge between us, the general public, and the specialists who will be talking later. So I'm going to give you an overview about the prehistory and history of Chagas disease, how we got there. And I would encourage you, while you watch the presentation, to think about some takeaways who might be instructive for public health policies today. Just think about them. Maybe at the end of the Q&A session, you might want to share them with us. Up to you. So let's move on. Okay, if I ask you to think of a truly great Brazilian team, no, it's not the wrong presentation. This is a truly great Brazilian team, but here are some players from another truly great Brazilian team. For Brazilians who are watching, you'll know a lot of institutes and hospitals with those names. And this is just to say that in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, Brazil had an unprecedented number of medical talents of the highest order. Some studied abroad, like Adolfo Lutz, who had his whole training abroad. Others never went abroad to study, but followed developments from afar. They sparked a revolution in public health in Brazil, and their legacy is felt to this day. So what happened? What made this revolution possible? Well, in the 19th century, as many of you know, I realized this doing research for this presentation. Medicine was transformed over the 19th century. In 1796, Edward Jenner defeats smallpox with the vaccine. Vaccine comes from the Latin vaca. Brazilians know the word, which means cow, because he used cowpox to make people immune to smallpox. That was the origin. Dr. Semmelweis from Hungary, it's an interesting story. He reduced childhood fever deaths dramatically by requiring hand sanitizing, but he didn't have the theoretical proof to explain, and so, well, he went crazy. The establishment did not accept him. Enter Louis Pasteur with the germ theory, Joseph Lister with antiseptic surgery, Robert Koch in Germany with germ theory as well. He made another great discovery, microphotography. And you had other developments like microbiology and bacteriology in Germany and France especially. The mosquito malaria theory, which was developed in England and then in Italy. And the foundation of the Institut Pasteur is a major landmark. And the Brazilian emperor, at the time Brazil was an empire, he made a big donation. There is his bust there at the Institut Pasteur to this day. This was also the time of imperialism, if you know the age of imperialism, and there was lots of wars. Large parts of Asia, Africa, and Oceania came under European control, and there were many local diseases like African trypanosomiasis, which kept the Europeans from exploiting the territories under their control. Soldiers or administrators would die, fall ill, even the natives. So what happened? Alexandre Yersin made major discoveries about bubonic plague. Paul-Louis Simon discovered further that rat fleas transmitted the bacterium. With this, between 1898 and 1900, we had tropical medicine institutes in Liverpool, London, and Hamburg. What do you notice about these three cities? They are port cities. They are the places where the contact with the colonies was the most intense. Then we had a major event, the Spanish-American War, and then the Walter Reed Commission in Cuba, who made tremendous experiments and managed to defeat yellow fever. They proved the theory of Carlos Finlay, presented in 1881, who hypothesized that that was a mosquito. At the time it was called Culex stegomia fasciata, now the Aedes aegypti. We all know him, unfortunately, too well. and they disproved the need for disinfection. This is important. Very quickly, you'll see the impact of this on life expectancy. There is a gap, of course, but you see it's like the evolution of population of the world. Over millennia, it remained about the same, and then it shot up in the 19th century. So what was going on in Brazil? Brazil was a strange colony. Unlike the Spanish colonies, the Portuguese did not allow the creation of universities or colleges there. Brazilians who wanted to pursue their education had to go to Portugal or to other places. So when the royal family fled Napoleon in 1808 when he invaded Portugal, the first thing they did was, among others, creating 2 colleges of medicine in Salvador and Rio. And since King Don John VI had lost 2 brothers and a son to smallpox, he made vaccination mandatory for everyone, except that there were no resources for that in the early 19th century. In the mid-19th century, you had yellow fever, lots of that, and yellow fever would remain until the early 20th century. The growth of cities caused other problems, and there was even less attention to provincial Brazil. There was a school I want to mention very quickly here, the Bahian Tropicalist School. They focused on tropical diseases, on the poor population, including slaves, and they especially mentioned that they didn't want the blind reproduction of European medical knowledge. They did follow European medical knowledge, but they looked at the local realities. These are 2 scenes of 19th century Rio. Just let that sink in a little bit to see. These are slaves throwing refuse and sewage into the water in the bay. And you see this is the impact of slavery on public health to this day. Well, enter self-interest. Slavery was going to be abolished. Little by little, it was being abolished, but you couldn't draw immigrants, and they were needed for coffee production, and São Paulo was the major coffee producer. So at that time, you had a governor called Rodrigues Alves. He lost a daughter to typhus, and his wife died in childbirth the same year. So I'm inclined to believe that he was very sincere in his support for public health. And he will play a role in this story, including about Chagas and so on. You had the other people who are mentioning here, and Oswaldo Cruz, who is one of the heroes today, cut his teeth in the fight against bubonic plague in Santos. Santos was, see why this is important. Coffee represented 2/3 of Brazil's total exports in the late 19th century, and they were produced mainly in São Paulo and shipped mainly through Santos. So if you couldn't attract immigrants, or if the harbor had epidemics all the time, the whole economy of the country would be paralyzed. How did Brazil look like in 1900? There were 17 million people. It's a huge country, as you can see. It's larger than the lower 48. 11 million of them were rural, and the life expectancy, keep this number in mind, 33 years old at the time. At the US at the time, it was 47 years old. Very low literacy. The population was less than half white, mostly mixed race plus blacks. And there was growing immigration, but the epidemics were preventing the growth of immigration. It was an agricultural country, and the censuses did not mention indigenous peoples at the time. So Rio de Janeiro was the capital since 1763, and you see that from 1872 to 1900, the population about trebled. And the population lived in crowd tenements. They had bubonic plague since 1899, yellow fever since the mid-19th century, as we saw, and smallpox is an old problem, and not only in Brazil. So the elites and the government spent the summer in the hills in Petrópolis, and the travelers, immigrants, shunned Brazil. At the time, the advertisements for the big transatlantic trips was from Hamburg to Buenos Aires without stopping in the yellow fever dance in Rio de Janeiro. So that was an advertising for trips. So who was taking charge? Oswaldo Cruz. Rodrigues Alves, remember him, the governor of São Paulo, who was the pioneer of public health initiatives. He had top priorities when he became president of Brazil. Sanitize and remodel Rio and expand railroads. Okay. Oswaldo Cruz had studied at Institut Pasteur, the first Brazilian there, and he was recommended personally by the director of Pasteur, Emile Roux. He was not well known, but he had a very strong personality. I demand full powers and resources. The president, go ahead, I lost a daughter to sickness, and I don't wish this pain to anyone. So who was him? He'll play a role in Chagas, you'll see that. He entered medical school at 15, graduated at 20 with a dissertation about microbiology. He was part of a group of Germanists. Everyone spoke French, I mean, in the elites in Brazil, so it doesn't count. But the fact that he spoke German was important because he was following medical developments in Germany, which was at the forefront of bacteriology and microbiology. He studied 2 years at Pasteur Institute. He worked in Santos Harbor during the major bubonic plague epidemic, and he showed that it could not be brought under control without serum. So he created the Federal Serotherapy Institute and directed it. His motto was in German, "Tue recht und scheue niemand," do the right thing and fear no one. That's important for public health. No compromise with disproved theories. He had a three-pronged approach. Bubonic plague, so kill rats everywhere, improve sanitation, provide serum. It was based on what was done in Santos. Yellow fever, eliminate larvae, stagnant water, fumigate everywhere, kill the mosquito, and no to disinfection. Because in Cuba, they proved that disinfection had no role in did not help stop the propagation of yellow fever. So he was under tremendous pressure to do disinfection. He said no. People will doubt it later that it was the mosquito. And smallpox, he was inspired on the German Empire legislation that made vaccination mandatory and eradicated smallpox there. There was a fourth enemy, public opinion. There were swindlers breeding rats to sell to the government. It happened not only in Brazil. I learned that in Singapore, when the English took charge, they wanted to eliminate rats, and the same thing happened there as well. There was some truculence in the public health approach, like fumigation, breaking into homes, vaccination, and there was a cultural thing. Husbands and parents did not want to allow their daughters to show their naked arms to be vaccinated. In Rio at that time, I said that they were remodeling. There was the knock it down, called in Portuguese, it's known as the bota abaixo. They transformed the face of Rio, and massive evictions were happening. So people were very tense at the time, and the population was illiterate. So campaigns to raise awareness did not work. What the result was, something we may view from a different place nowadays in 2023, the vaccine revolt. After 6,000 cases of smallpox in 1904, vaccination was mandatory. So the whole set of interests, a fed-up population, the opposition, military rebels rose in revolt. It took 10 days to quell the revolt, and the president refused to fire Oswaldo Cruz, but they revoked the obligation for vaccination, except that the proof of vaccination continued to be required, like for COVID, to go to some places. And the full eradication eventually came only in the 1970s. That was the result of this vaccine revolt. But Rio changed. This is what was called then the Avenida Central, inspired by the Haussmann reforms of Paris. And the municipal theater there is inspired on the opera house, the Opéra de Paris. Uh, what happened? The yellow fever dropped from 584 to 0. Bubonic plague was virtually eliminated. There was a steady decline in smallpox cases, but eventually, in 1908, when there was a new bout of smallpox, the population spontaneously requested vaccination. Eventually, the success of vaccination fostered pro-vaccine culture countrywide. This is the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. After he got a gold medal in Berlin, and Brazilians at the time, they wanted to affirm their nationhood. They were very sensitive to these honors abroad. He started getting official and public support. And he always encouraged hands-on training and solid academic studies among his staff. The Federal Serotherapy was renamed Oswaldo Cruz Institute. There was scientific research, vaccines and medicine production, public health activities. All to this day, you see that the building was inspired in the Alhambra and in the Berlin synagogue. He ensured, very important for public health, he ensured independent funding sources. They played a major role among COVID, and they are among the 15 largest vaccine producers in the world. You see, the Minister of Health in Brazil was the former president of Fiocruz. Dr. Jarbas Barbosa, the Director General of PAHO, used to study at Fiocruz, and the head of the Global Chagas Disease Program at the WHO also had his PhD at Fiocruz. Well, I was talking about Rio. With the success in Rio, Rio was a showroom for the world and for Brazil. They start expanding coverage. They start inspecting other harbors, and state governments at the time and private businesses starting hiring their services. The first mission was in Maranhão against bubonic fever, and then Carlos Chagas, we get to him, but Oswaldo Cruz was important as well. Was sent to remote areas to fight malaria. The first anti-malaria campaigns anywhere based on recent science. And Chagas was sent in 1907 to Minas Gerais state to fight a malaria outbreak, preventing the railroad expansion. Now, who was Carlos Chagas? He was born in a coffee plantation in Minas Gerais. Important, pay attention to this. He flunked the examination for engineering college. So, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to study medicine. Let's go. Med school it is. That's what he really wanted, because he became one of the best doctors anywhere in the world. For his PhD dissertation about malaria, he is mentored by Oswaldo Cruz. He's assigned sanitary missions to fight malaria outbreaks. And then in 1907, as we said, he was sent to Minas Gerais, to a city called La Sanz, to fight a bout of malaria. He builds a lab. He's too curious. That's why med school was the right thing for him. He starts researching animals and insects in the area, and he finds a protozoan parasite in the blood of marmosets. He called it Trypanosoma minacense. A railway engineer shows him an insect that bites human, often in the face. He was nicknamed the barber. And it's a kissing bug. You see the gentleman bug, kissing bug. In some of these, Chagas finds a trypanosoma shaped, in the blood of some of these, he finds a trypanosoma-shaped protozoan. He sends the insects to the Oswaldo Cruz lab in Rio, and Oswaldo Cruz notices that the lab monkey is contaminated after an insect bite. Chagas realizes then that it's a new species of parasite and baptizes it Trypanosoma cruzi in honor of Oswaldo Cruz. That's why I said that the two are heroes in this story. That's the American trypanosomiasis, and he published about the discovery in Germany, about the two trypanosomes, and because Germany was the place, the first newsletter of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation was in Portuguese and German, by the way. Thank you, Carolina, for letting me know. It raised enormous interest because they saw a relationship with the African trypanosomiasis, which was preventing colonization. I told you that things will will be connected. So he returns to Las Sanz to see if this affects humans as well. After finding an infected cat, domestic cat, he identified the Trypanosoma cruzi in the blood of Berenice, a 2-year-old girl. There is a worldwide repercussion of the American trypanosomiasis, and soon it was baptized the Chagas disease. And it was the major attraction in Dresden in 1911. This, to the right, is Berenice, the first people diagnosed with Chagas, and she died for other reasons at 74. This is his achievement. He was the first scientist in the world, again, thank you, Carolina, to describe the complete disease cycle. The agent, the Trypanosoma cruzi, the vector, the transmitter, the kissing bug, the host, people and vertebrates, and the symptoms. And this is taken from this comic book here. You see the picture, for those of you who are on Zoom, you see the picture. It's available in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And we are going to work on the wide distribution of this to raise awareness about Chagas. What's his legacy? He encouraged further the discovery of Chagas disease, encouraged further expedition and research on local infirmities. The Oswaldo Cruz Institute extended his activities nationwide, much beyond Rio, and develops international partnerships because the Germans were interested, the French, and many others. And the Institute wanted to be in the know about cutting-edge research elsewhere. Cruz died at 44 years old. Chagas became president of the Institute for 17 years. And in 1918, he mounted an effective response to the Spanish flu epidemic. After his predecessor bungled the response a little bit, he took charge and eventually brought it under control. He was twice nominated to Nobel. This is another presentation about this. He wanted Berenice, the girl, to study in Rio, but her family refused. He continued research on Chagas, other diseases, and trained scientists. You see in the picture, his two doctors, Carlos Chagas Filho, the smaller one, and Evandro Chagas, became acclaimed doctors themselves. And one of our speakers today works at the Evandro Chagas Institute. And here is a visit by Albert Einstein, from Albert Einstein to the Fiocruz in 1925. And you see Adolfo Lutz. I couldn't speak so much about him. He's, some people say he was among the greatest scientists who ever lived. As a result of all this, I'm coming to the end. The evolution of life expectancy in Brazil, it more than doubled between the early 1900, when serious public health efforts started, to 2020. Of course, there were improvements in education, sanitation, economic growth, migration to big cities, but most of all, it is due to a public health structure, which is the true legacy of Oswaldo Cruz, Carlos Chagas, Adolfo Lutz, and many, many others. But much remains to be done, including about Chagas disease. And Colin will talk about this more, maybe. This is taken from the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative website. There are maybe more than that. These numbers may be underestimated. Over 6 million people estimated to have Chagas in the world. For example, Dr. Peter Hotez thought about the 300,000 people infected in the States, and he said it could be as many as 1 million, in his opinion. But this is all educated guesses, let's say. 30,000 new cases per year, 12,000 deaths per year, and only 30%, you heard Myra, only 30% of those infected have been diagnosed. It's endemic, and it's now present in many places across the world. That's why this begs the question, should we still call it a neglected tropical disease? You see, it's present in the States, in Canada, in all of Europe, in Japan, Australia, New Zealand. But there are reasons for hope. We have the World Chagas Disease Day since 2020, a growing number of researchers worldwide studying Chagas, some of them here today. New treatments are being tested. Jair and others will be talking about this. There are possible vaccines in the making. I'll leave it to the others. Partnerships, unprecedented global cooperation, and I think this seminar is part of that, and awareness raising initiatives, also part of this. Thank you very much for your attention. And